The rain came down hard on the roof of the stable, and Alira Whitmore pressed her back against the cold wooden wall, trying to stay warm. Her thin blanket was already wet at the edges. Somewhere near her feet, a horse shifted its weight and let out a low sound, as if it understood her better than the people inside the big house ever did. She had not always slept here. 5 years ago, when her parents died in a fever that swept through the village, she came to work for the Ashworth family as a kitchen maid. She was 19 then. Now she was 24, and Lady Constance Ashworth had decided, without asking anyone, that the stable was the proper place for a woman like her. "She smells like smoke and dirt," Lady Constance had said one evening, loud enough for the whole staff to hear. "Keep her away from the good rooms." No one argued. No one ever argued with Lady Constance. Alira pulled her knees to her chest and closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. The wind pushed through a crack in the wall, and somewhere in the dark, an owl called out twice, then went silent. She thought about her mother's hands, how they used to smooth her hair before bed. That memory was the only warm thing she had left. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground outside the stable had turned to mud. Alira woke before the sun was fully up, the way she always did, because the horses needed feeding and no one else would do it. Her fingers were stiff with cold as she carried the buckets of water, one after another, from the well to the trough. A young man named Colin, who worked in the stable full-time, watched her from the doorway. He was a year older than her, quiet, with a habit of chewing on the end of a piece of straw when he was thinking about something he did not want to say out loud. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired," Alira answered, "but there is no use talking about it." Colin did not push further. He knew, better than most, what happened to servants who complained. He had seen it happen to a girl before Alira, a girl who no longer worked at the estate and whose name nobody spoke anymore. Inside the main house, the day began the way it always did. Bells rang. Doors opened and closed. Lady Constance called for her tea to be brought exactly at 8, not a minute before or after, and if it arrived late, someone would lose a week's wages. Her husband, Lord Edmund Ashworth, rarely left his study except for meals, and even then he said very little. It was Lady Constance who ran the household, who decided who ate well and who did not, who slept in a warm bed and who slept with the horses. Their son, a boy of 10 named Aldrich, was the only member of the family who ever looked at Alira with something other than annoyance. Once, when no one was watching, he had slipped her a piece of bread from his own plate. She never forgot that. Small kindness in a place like this felt like a gift too large to carry. That morning, a letter arrived by Ryder, sealed with a mark that made the head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Prout, go pale the moment she saw it. "The Duke is coming," Mrs. Prout announced to the staff gathered in the kitchen. "Duke Gareth Ashcombe. He writes that he will arrive within the week to review the estate's accounts." A murmur passed through the room. The Duke was a distant relative of Lord Edmund, and though the family rarely spoke of him directly, everyone knew that the Ashworth estate depended on his goodwill. Debts had piled up over the years, debts that Lord Edmund preferred not to discuss, and it was widely understood that the Duke's visits were never purely social. Lady Constance received the news with a tight smile. "Then we must make sure everything appears exactly as it should," she said, looking around the kitchen as if searching for anything that might embarrass her. Her eyes passed over Alira for half a second longer than necessary. Everything in its proper place. Alira understood the warning without needing it explained. She was to stay out of sight. Over the next several days, the house transformed. Curtains were washed. Silver was polished until it gleamed under candlelight. The gardens were trimmed, the gravel paths raked smooth, and the family portraits in the main hall were dusted for the first time in months. Lady Constance walked through every room twice a day, correcting small things that no one else would have noticed, snapping at maids who moved too slowly. Through all of this, Alira continued her work in the stable, mostly forgotten, which suited her fine. She fed the horses, cleaned their stalls, and in the quiet hours before dawn, she sometimes allowed herself to imagine a different life. A life where she had a room with a door that locked from the inside, where no one decided for her where she was allowed to exist. Colin noticed she had grown quieter than usual as the day of the Duke's arrival approached. "You're thinking too much," he said one afternoon, watching her brush down one of the older horses, a gentle gray mare named Willow. "Someone has to think," Alira replied. "The rest of this house seems too busy pretending." Colin almost smiled at that, but he caught himself, glancing toward the house as if the walls themselves might report him for it. On the morning the Duke was expected, the household staff lined up outside the front entrance in their cleanest clothes, standing straight, waiting. Lady Constance stood at the front, her chin lifted, practicing the expression of warm hospitality she always wore for guests of importance. Lord Edmund stood beside her, straightening his coat for the third time. But the Duke did not arrive at the front gate the way they expected. He came early, and he came alone, having left his carriage and most of his men at the edge of the property so he could walk the grounds himself. It was a habit of his, one that made those who managed his properties nervous, because he preferred to see things as they truly were before anyone had the chance to arrange them otherwise. He walked past the gardens, past the neatly raked paths, past the polished front steps where the staff still stood waiting for a carriage that was not coming. He walked, instead, toward the stable, drawn by nothing more than curiosity and the sound of a horse whinnying somewhere behind the trees. And there, in the dim morning light, he found something the family had never intended for him to see. A folded blanket in the corner of a stall, still damp from the rain 2 nights before. A small shard of broken mirror propped against a beam, catching the early sun. A name scratched carefully into the wood of a post, the letters small and neat. Alira. He stood there for a long moment, saying nothing, simply looking. Then he turned to Colin, who had frozen mid-task at the sight of a stranger in fine traveling clothes standing in the doorway of the stable. "Who sleeps here?" the Duke asked, his voice calm without any accusation in it yet. Colin's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced toward the house, toward the family who did not yet know the Duke had arrived, toward the girl who was, at that very moment, carrying water from the well and had not seen him come. "I asked you a question," the Duke said, gentler this time, but no less certain that he already knew the shape of the answer. Colin swallowed hard. "A girl, sir, Alira. She works in the kitchen and here in the stable." "And where does she sleep at night?" The silence that followed told the Duke everything the boy's fear would not let him say aloud. The Duke looked once more around the stall, at the blanket, at the mirror shard catching the light, at the name carved into the post, and something in his expression changed, though it was subtle enough that Colin could not have named it if asked. It was not anger, not yet. It was the look of a man filing away a fact he intended to return to. "Say nothing of this to the family," the Duke said finally. "Not yet." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Colin standing there with his heart pounding, and leaving behind him a stable that suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. By the time Alira returned with the last bucket of water, the yard outside the house was full of noise, servants rushing in every direction, the family finally realizing that their honored guest had arrived without the ceremony they had spent a week preparing for. She did not know yet that anything had changed. She did not know that a man she had never met had just stood in the very place she called home, and asked a question that would, in time, unravel everything Lady Constance had built her comfort upon. She only knew that the air felt different that morning, though she could not have said why. Somewhere inside the house, a bell rang calling the staff to gather. Somewhere inside the house. Lady Constance was smoothing her skirts and preparing her warmest smile for a guest she believed she could still control. And somewhere between the stable and the front steps, a decision had already been made, quietly, without a single word spoken to the family who thought they held every advantage. The Duke had seen the truth, and men like Gareth Ashcombe did not simply look away once they had. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Alira was called to the kitchen earlier than usual. Mrs. Prout handed her a stack of plates without meeting her eyes, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from nerves or something else, Alira could not tell. "There is a guest tonight," Mrs. Prout said. "A very important one. Keep to the kitchen. Do not let yourself be seen." Alira nodded, used to such instructions, though something about the way Mrs. Prout said them felt heavier than usual, as if the housekeeper herself was afraid of what might happen if the rule was broken. From the small window near the kitchen sink, Alira could just make out the edge of the dining hall, candlelight flickering against the glass. She caught only a glimpse of the man seated at the head of the table, dressed finer than anyone she had ever seen enter this house, his posture straight, his expression unreadable even from a distance. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that he had already stood in her stable that morning, already seen the small proof of the life she had been given. She only knew, standing there with a stack of plates in her arms, that something in the house had shifted quietly, like the first crack forming in a wall that had stood for a very long time. Outside, the horses in the stable settled for the night, unaware that the man who had looked at their home with such quiet attention would soon return, and that his return would change everything. Dinner in the great hall that evening was a performance, and everyone at the table knew it, even if only one person there refused to pretend otherwise. Lady Constance sat at the far end, dressed in deep green silk that had been let out at the seams just that afternoon so it would fit properly again. She smiled often, laughed at moments that were not particularly funny, and spoke at length about the improvements she claimed to have made to the estate that year. Lord Edmund said little, as usual, nodding along whenever his wife glanced his way, refilling his glass more often than the conversation seemed to require. Duke Gareth Ashcombe sat across from them, listening more than he spoke. He was a man in his early 40s, with a calm face that gave away very little, and eyes that moved carefully around a room, taking note of things others might miss. He had traveled a great deal in his years managing family properties across the region, and in that time he had learned to recognize the difference between a household that was well run and a household that had simply learned to look well run for a single evening. "You must be pleased with how the harvest went this year," the Duke said, cutting gently into the conversation. "The fields looked healthy on my way in." "Very pleased," Lady Constance answered quickly. "We have been careful with every part of the estate, every corner, every detail." "Every corner," the Duke repeated almost to himself and took a slow sip from his glass. He asked, in the manner of someone simply making polite conversation, after the staff. He asked about the cook, whose bread he remembered fondly from a visit years before. He asked about an older groundskeeper who had once shown him a particular rose garden with great pride. Lady Constance answered each question smoothly, nomming names, offering small compliments about loyal service, clearly enjoying the chance to display her command of the household. Then the Duke asked about the stable. "I noticed on my walk in this morning that the stable is very well kept," he said. "Who manages it?" "Colin," Lady Constance answered without hesitation. "A capable young man. He has worked for us since he was a boy." "And does he manage it alone?" For the first time that evening, Lady Constance's smile faltered, just slightly, just long enough for someone paying close attention to notice. "There is a kitchen maid who assists with some of the lighter duties there," she said. "Nothing of importance." "What is her name?" The question hung in the air a moment longer than it should have. Lord Edmund glanced up from his glass. Even the servant standing near the wall, waiting to clear the next course, seemed to hold very still. "Alira," Lady Constance said finally, the name coming out clipped as if she resented having to speak it at all. "She is new, still learning her place." 5 years, the Duke said, quiet, almost pleasant. That is what I understand, not so new. Lady Constance's fork paused above her plate. You have been speaking with the staff, then? I spoke with no one of importance, the Duke said, and something in the careful way he said it made it clear he had chosen his words precisely. I simply walked the grounds this morning, as I always do before a visit begins. I find it useful to see a place before it has been arranged for me. The room fell quiet in a way that felt different from the polite quiet of a proper dinner. Lady Constance recovered quickly, laughing lightly and changing the subject to a new set of curtains she had commissioned for the drawing room, but the Duke noticed that her hand, resting on the table, had curled slightly, the knuckles pale. He said nothing further about the stable for the rest of the meal. When dinner ended and the family retired to the drawing room for tea, the Duke excused himself, claiming the long journey had left him tired. Lady Constance offered him the finest guest room in the house, freshly prepared for his arrival, but he requested instead a smaller room near the east wing, one usually reserved for visiting merchants and lesser guests. "Are you certain, Your Grace?" Lady Constance asked, clearly confused by the request. "The blue room has been prepared especially." "I am certain," the Duke said. "I sleep better in quiet corners of a house. It is a small habit of mine." What he did not say was that the east wing sat closer to the stable than the blue room did, close enough that its single window looked out over the very yard where he had stood that morning. Alone in the small room that night, the Duke removed his coat and sat by the window for a long while, looking out into the darkness. He could just make out the shape of the stable against the night sky, a low building with a faint light glowing somewhere inside it, likely a lantern left burning for the animals. He thought of the folded blanket. He thought of the mirror shard catching the morning light. He thought of the name carved carefully into the wooden post, the letters small, as if the person who made them had not wanted to draw attention to their own existence. 5 years, he thought. 5 years in this house, and not once seated at a table, not once given a proper room, not once, it seemed, considered by the family who employed her as anything more than an inconvenience to be hidden away. He had seen cruelty before in other households, in other families who believed that wealth excused them from basic decency. He had learned over time that such cruelty rarely announced itself loudly. It hid in small arrangements, in the details no one thought to question, in the quiet acceptance of servants too afraid to speak and family members too comfortable to notice. He intended to look closer. The next morning, he rose before the household staff had begun their usual rounds, dressing simply, without the fine coat he had worn for dinner the night before, choosing instead something plain enough that he might pass, at a distance, for one of the estate's own workers. It was another habit of his, one that had served him well over the years. People spoke more freely and behaved more honestly around a man they did not recognize as their better. He made his way toward the stable, the morning air still cool, the grass wet beneath his boots. He heard voices before he reached the door, low and familiar, the voices of 2 people who believed themselves alone. "You should tell someone," Colin was saying, his voice tight with worry. "The Duke asked me directly yesterday. I could not lie to him." "You did not lie," came the second voice, calm despite the words. "You simply did not offer more than what was asked." "He knows there is something wrong, Elira. A man like that does not ask simple questions without reason." There was a pause, filled only by the soft sound of a horse shifting in its stall. "It does not matter what he knows," Elira said finally. "By the time it matters to him, he will be gone again, back to his own estates, his own concerns. Men like him do not change houses like this one. They only visit them." The Duke stood outside the door, listening, his presence still unknown to either of them. Something in her voice struck him, not self-pity, not despair, but a kind of tired certainty, the certainty of someone who had learned, through repeated disappointment, not to expect rescue from anyone. He stepped forward, and the conversation stopped at once. Alira turned first, recognizing him immediately despite his plain clothes, the memory of his face from dinner the night before returning quickly. She straightened, smoothing her apron out of habit, the posture of someone trained to appear composed no matter the circumstance. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes flicked briefly toward Colin, who had gone very still beside her. "We did not expect anyone this early." "I imagine not," the Duke said. He looked between them for a moment, then addressed Colin directly. "Would you give us the yard for a few minutes?" Colin hesitated, glancing at Alira as if seeking permission, then nodded and stepped outside, though he did not go far, lingering near the fence where he could still see the stable door. The Duke turned back to Alira. "I am not here to cause trouble for you," he said. "I only wish to understand something." "And if understanding it causes trouble anyway?" she asked, her chin lifting slightly, a flash of something sharper than the calm exhaustion in her earlier words. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I have seen kindness turn into consequence before. It rarely benefits the person receiving it." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something about her directness, her refusal to simply agree with him out of fear, seemed to settle something in his mind. "That is a fair concern," he said. "I will not ask you to trust me with words alone, but I would ask you to allow me a few days to observe this household properly before you decide whether my presence here means anything at all." Alira said nothing, but she did not turn away either, and the Duke took that, for now, as answer enough. He left the stable a few minutes later, walking back toward the house as the household staff began to stir for the day, none of them aware of the conversation that had just taken place, none of them aware that the man they believed was here only to review accounts and ledgers had begun, quietly and carefully, to review something else entirely. Inside the house, Lady Constance was already awake, standing at her window, watching the Duke's figure cross the yard from a distance too great to hear anything that had been said. She did not know the content of the conversation, but she recognized, with a small and unwelcome tightening in her chest, the direction from which he had come. She rang for Mrs. Pruitt at once. "Keep the stable girl in the kitchen today," she said, her voice clipped. "Give her no reason to speak with anyone she should not." Mrs. Pruitt, who had served the family long enough to know better than to ask questions she did not want answered, simply nodded and went to arrange it, though even she, walking down the corridor a moment later, found herself wondering exactly how much the Duke had already seen. The kitchen that morning was busier than usual, filled with the clatter of pots and the shouted instructions of the head cook, a broad woman named Mrs. Holt who had little patience for slow hands but a surprisingly soft heart underneath her sharp tongue. Alira worked at the far end, scrubbing pans left over from the previous night's dinner, her thoughts still turning over the conversation from the stable. She had not expected the Duke to seek her out directly. In 5 years of service, no member of the family, let alone a guest of such standing, had ever spoken to her as though her answer mattered. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, because hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing to carry in a house like this one. Hope made disappointment sharper when it inevitably came. Mrs. Holt noticed her distraction and nudged her with an elbow. "Wherever your mind has wandered off to, girl, bring it back. These pans will not scrub themselves." "Sorry, Mrs. Holt," Alira said, and returned her attention to the work in front of her, though her thoughts refused to settle entirely. Across the estate, the Duke spent the morning exactly as Lady Constance expected him to, seated in the study with Lord Edmund, reviewing ledgers, asking pointed questions about expenditures that did not add up cleanly. Lord Edmund answered as best he could, though it was clear from his hesitations that many of the household's decisions were not truly his own to explain. "This entry here," the Duke said, tapping a line in the account book. "Wages for household staff. I count 7 names listed for the year, yet I understand from the housekeeper that closer to 9 people work within these walls." Lord Edmund shifted uncomfortably. Some arrangements are informal, Your Grace. Certain staff receive room and board in place of full wages." "I see," the Duke said, though his tone made it clear he intended to look further into what exactly counted as room and board within this household. He made a small note in the margin of the ledger, something Lord Edmund did not see clearly enough to read, and moved the conversation forward, patient, giving no immediate sign of what conclusions he was drawing. By midday, the Duke requested a tour of the full estate, including the working areas usually left out of such visits, the laundry house, the root cellar, and eventually, the stable once more. Lady Constance insisted on joining this time, unwilling to allow him to wander unsupervised a second time. "You have already seen the stable, Your Grace," she said lightly, as they walked the gravel path. "I am sure there is little more to interest you there." "On the contrary," the Duke replied, his tone pleasant, unreadable. "I find stables tell a great deal about how an estate treats those who serve it. A poorly kept stable often means poorly kept people as well." Lady Constance's smile tightened, but she said nothing further, matching his pace as they approached the building. Inside, Colin was mending a section of fence that had come loose, and he straightened quickly at their arrival, offering a respectful nod. The Duke walked the length of the stable slowly, running his hand along the wooden beams, glancing again toward the corner stall where he had first seen the folded blanket, though it had since been tucked away out of sight, likely on Lady Constance's earlier instruction. "Everything appears in good order," Lady Constance said, a note of relief creeping into her voice. "Indeed," the Duke said, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on the corner stall than anywhere else, and Lady Constance, watching him closely, felt her relief curdle into unease. That evening, another dinner was arranged, this time smaller, more private, at Lady Constance's insistence. Perhaps hopping a quieter setting would ease the tension that had settled over the house since the previous night's conversation. The Duke accepted, though he requested, almost as an afterthought, that the meal be served slightly later than usual. "I find I have a great deal of correspondence to attend to first," he explained. "Matters concerning several of my own properties. I hope it will not inconvenience the kitchen." Lady Constance assured him it would not, and the household adjusted accordingly, pushing the meal back by nearly an hour, which meant, though no one realized it at the time, that the kitchen staff remained at their posts later into the evening than usual, still finishing preparations when the Duke, rather than retreating to his room to handle correspondence, made his way instead toward the kitchen itself. He entered quietly, unnoticed at first amid the noise and heat of the evening's final preparations, and stood near the doorway simply observing. Mrs. Holt barked instructions to two younger kitchen maids. A boy carried firewood in from the yard. And near the far wall, Elira worked steadily, arranging a tray of bread with careful, practiced hands, her expression calm but distant, the look of someone who had long ago learned to make herself as unremarkable as possible in rooms where she did not feel welcome. It was Mrs. Holt who noticed him first, nearly dropping the pot she was carrying in surprise. "Your Grace," she said quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, "forgive us, we did not expect you here." "The fault is entirely mine for arriving unannounced," the Duke said easily. "Please, continue. I only wish to see the kitchen before dinner. I find good food deserves acknowledgement of the hands that make it." Mrs. Holt, flustered but pleased by the compliment, resumed her work, though the room's energy shifted slightly. Everyone suddenly aware of being watched by someone whose opinion carried weight far beyond this household. The Duke moved slowly through the kitchen, offering small comments here and there, genuine in their curiosity rather than performative, asking Mrs. Holt about a particular spice she used in the evening sauce, complimenting a young maid on the careful way she arranged a serving plate. It was, in its own quiet way, a kind of test, though only he understood its purpose. He wished to see how this household treated its people when it believed itself unobserved by anyone who mattered. And now, with his sudden presence, he wished to see how quickly that behavior would shift back toward performance. Eventually, he found himself near the end of the kitchen where Alira stood, and he stopped there, watching her arrange the last of the bread onto its tray. "That looks well done," he said simply. She glanced up, startled to find him standing so close, and for a brief moment, something like alarm crossed her face before she smoothed it into the careful neutrality she wore like armor. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "It is only bread." "Even simple things can be done with care or without it," he replied. "I notice the difference more than people expect." She said nothing to that, uncertain how to respond to a man of his position speaking to her so directly in front of the rest of the staff, several of whom had gone quiet, watching the exchange with poorly hidden curiosity. The Duke did not linger. He offered a small nod, thanked Mrs. Holt once more for her hospitality, and left the kitchen the way he had come, leaving behind a room full of servants who would spend the rest of the evening quietly speculating about what exactly had just taken place, and why a man of his standing had chosen to notice, of all people, the quiet kitchen maid who slept in the stable. Dinner that night passed with less tension than the evening before, though Lady Constance remained watchful, her earlier ease replaced by a careful attentiveness to every word the Duke spoke. He asked no further pointed questions about the staff, choosing instead to discuss matters of trade routes and upcoming harvests, subjects that allowed Lord Edmund to speak more freely and Lady Constance to relax slightly, believing perhaps that the difficult moment had passed. She was mistaken. Later that night, long after the household had settled into sleep, the Duke sat once more by the window of his small room, a single candle burning low beside him, a folded piece of paper on the desk where he had been writing steadily for the better part of an hour. It was not correspondence regarding his other properties, as he had claimed earlier that evening. It was something else entirely, a careful accounting of everything he had observed since his arrival, dates, small details, the discrepancy in the household ledger, the state of the stable, the conversation he had overheard between Colin and Alira, the tightness in Lady Constance's expression whenever the topic arose. He was building something, methodically, the way he approached every serious matter in his life, refusing to act on assumption alone when patience could provide him certainty instead. Outside his window, the stable sat dark and quiet, save for the faint glow of a single lantern near its entrance. He wondered, not for the first time that night, how many nights Alira had spent exactly as she likely was now, curled beneath a thin blanket, listening to the wind find its way through gaps in old wood, while inside the main house, warm beds sat empty in rooms reserved for guests who visited only a handful of times each year. He thought of her words from that morning, "Men like him do not change houses like this one, they only visit them." He intended to prove her wrong. The following day, the Duke requested a private meeting with Mrs. Prout, catching the housekeeper alone in the linen room during a quiet hour of the afternoon. She startled at his sudden appearance, nearly dropping the folded sheets she carried. "Your Grace," she said, straightening quickly, "how may I assist you?" "I would like to ask you some questions," he said, his tone even, "and I would ask that you answer them honestly, without fear of what Lady Constance might say afterward. I give you my word that nothing you tell me will be repeated in a way that endangers your position here." Mrs. Prout hesitated, torn between years of loyalty born from necessity and a growing discomfort she had carried for longer than she liked to admit. "What is it you wish to know, Your Grace?" "How long has Alira slept in the stable?" The housekeeper's hands tightened around the linen she held. "Nearly 2 years now, Your Grace." "And before that?" "She shared a small room with 2 other maids, above the kitchen." "What changed?" Mrs. Prout hesitated again, longer this time, her eyes flicking toward the door as though checking for anyone who might overhear. Lady Constance believed she was becoming too familiar with young Master Aldrich. There was no wrongdoing, Your Grace, I promise you that. The boy simply favored her company, as children sometimes do with kind servants. But Lady Constance did not care for it, and rather than address the matter gently, she decided Alira should be removed from the house entirely. The Duke absorbed this information quietly, his expression giving nothing away, though something in his chest tightened at the picture forming before him. A woman punished not for any fault of her own, but for the simple crime of being kind to a child who needed it. "Thank you, Mrs. Prout," he said finally. "You have been more helpful than you know." The housekeeper nodded, though worry remained etched across her face. "Your Grace, I must ask, what will you do with this information?" The Duke considered the question carefully before answering. "What should have been done a long time ago," he said. "I intend to make certain this house begins treating its people the way people deserve to be treated, all of them." He left her standing there among the folded linens, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long while inside these walls: hope. The next 2 days passed with a strange, uneasy calm settling over the estate. Lady Constance, sensing that something had shifted but unable to name exactly what, grew sharper with the staff, correcting small mistakes with unusual harshness, as though tightening her grip on the household might somehow undo whatever the Duke had already learned. Alira felt the change most of all. Twice, Mrs. Prout found small excuses to keep her occupied indoors, away from the yard, away from any chance encounter with the Duke, though he had made no further attempt to seek her out directly since their conversation in the kitchen. She told herself this was for the best. Whatever attention he had shown her, whatever questions he had asked, meant little in the end. He would leave, as men of his position always did, and the house would return to what it had always been. Still, at night, lying beneath her thin blanket in the stable, she found herself thinking of his words. What should have been done a long time ago? She did not know he had said them, not directly to her, but something in his manner during their brief exchanges carried a weight she could not fully dismiss, no matter how hard she tried. On the third morning after his arrival, the Duke requested a full account of the estate's finances be prepared for his review that afternoon, along with a complete list of every person currently employed on the property, their duties, their wages, and their living arrangements. Lord Edmund, growing increasingly nervous under the weight of the Duke's careful attention, agreed at once, though Lady Constance protested privately that such a detailed accounting was unnecessary. "He is here to review the estate's debts, not to catalogue every servant's sleeping arrangements," she said sharply to her husband, packing the length of their private sitting room. "You allow him too much reach into matters that do not concern him." "He holds our debts, Constance," Lord Edmund said tiredly, rubbing his temples. "That gives him every right to concern himself with whatever he pleases." Lady Constance said nothing further, though her jaw tightened, and she resolved, quietly, to prepare her own version of events before the Duke could form conclusions entirely on his own. That afternoon, she requested a private audience with him, finding him in the study surrounded by ledgers and papers, a quill resting beside a half-finished letter she could not read from where she stood. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying the same warm smoothness she used with every guest of importance, "I understand you have requested information regarding our household staff. I wish to offer what context I could, in case any arrangement appeared unusual without proper explanation." "I welcome context," the Duke said evenly, setting down his quill. "Please sit." She did, arranging her skirts carefully before beginning. "There is a kitchen maid, Alira, whose sleeping arrangement I understand may have drawn your attention. I wish you to know it was never intended as punishment. The stable required someone reliable nearby to assist with the animals during early morning hours, and given her willingness to rise early regardless, it seemed a practical solution for everyone involved." The Duke listened without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing of what he already knew. "She has never complained of the arrangement," Lady Constance continued. "If she found it truly unsuitable, I am certain she would have said so." "Would she?" the Duke asked quietly. "In your experience, Lady Constance, do the people who depend entirely on your goodwill for their continued employment feel free to voice complaints against your decisions?" Lady Constance's composure flickered just slightly. "I have always treated my staff fairly." "I have spoken with several members of your staff over these past few days," the Duke said, his tone remaining calm, almost gentle, though the words themselves carried a weight that made Lady Constance's hands tighten in her lap. "I have reviewed your household ledgers. I have seen, with my own eyes, where Elira sleeps, and I have learned from more than one source the true reason behind that arrangement." The room went very quiet. "I do not believe this began as a matter of stable duties," the Duke continued. "I believe it began because a young woman showed kindness to your son, and you decided that kindness was unwelcome enough to warrant removing her from the house entirely." Lady Constance's face paled, though she attempted with visible effort to maintain her composure. "Your Grace, I assure you, the situation is far more complicated than—" "I am not interested in complications that exist only to excuse cruelty," the Duke interrupted, his voice still even, still controlled, but carrying now an unmistakable firmness that had not been present before. "I have seen this pattern in other households, Lady Constance. Small cruelties, justified by small explanations, until the accumulation of them becomes something far larger than any single excuse could account for. You cannot possibly understand every detail of running an estate such as this one," Lady Constance said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice now, the polished composure finally beginning to crack. "There are pressures you are not aware of, expectations, appearances that must be maintained." "I am aware of a great many pressures," the Duke said. "I am also aware that this estate currently owes a significant sum to my family, a debt that has grown steadily over the past several years due to decisions made largely within this household, decisions I have reviewed carefully in your ledgers these past 2 days." Lady Constance's mouth opened, then closed, no ready response prepared for this particular turn. "I did not come here simply to review numbers on a page," the Duke continued. "I came to understand the full state of this estate, and I have found that state to be troubling in more ways than one. The debts are concerning. The treatment of your staff, particularly of one young woman who has served this household loyally for 5 years without complaint, despite conditions that no one in this room would tolerate for themselves, is far more troubling still." "What is it you intend to do?" Lord Edmund asked quietly, having entered the room partway through the conversation, standing now near the doorway, his face drawn and pale. The Duke turned to him. "I intend to call a full gathering of the household tomorrow morning, staff included. I believe certain matters require clarity, and I do not intend to leave this estate until they have received it." Lady Constance rose from her chair abruptly. "You would humiliate this family in front of our own servants." "I would offer honesty," the Duke said, standing as well, his calm never wavering despite the rising tension in the room. "If honesty humiliates you, Lady Constance, I would suggest examining more closely why that might be the case, rather than blaming the person who finally speaks it aloud." She had no answer for that. She stood there, silk skirts rustling faintly as she shifted her weight, searching for some argument that might undo what had already been set in motion, but finding nothing that would hold against the quiet certainty in the Duke's expression. That evening, word spread quickly through the household that a gathering had been called for the following morning, though no one below the family understood exactly what it concerned. Whispers moved from the kitchen to the laundry house to the stable, each person offering their own guess, most too afraid to speculate aloud beyond a hushed exchange between trusted friends. Colin found Elira in the stable that night, sitting near Willow's stall, her knees drawn up, staring at nothing in particular. "Have you heard?" he asked, settling beside her. "Everyone gathering tomorrow morning, something to do with the Duke." "I heard," Elira said quietly. "Do you think it concerns you?" She was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over in her mind. "I do not know what to think anymore," she admitted finally. "For 5 years, nothing here has changed, no matter how unfair it became. I learned not to expect it to, but something about the way he looks at things, the way he asks questions others never bother to ask, it makes me wonder if perhaps this time might be different." "And if it is not?" Colin asked gently. "Then I will have lost nothing I did not already expect to lose," she said. "But if it is different, even slightly, I do not wish to have spent tonight convincing myself it could never be so." Colin said nothing further, simply sitting beside her in the quiet dark, the two of them listening to the soft shifting of the horses settling in for the night, neither of them aware of how close that hope stood to becoming something real. Inside the main house, the Duke sat once more at his desk, finishing the final preparations for the morning ahead, a single candle burning low beside stacks of paper covered in careful, deliberate handwriting. He had spent years managing estates far larger than this one, had seen far greater fortunes and far deeper corruptions than what he had uncovered here. Yet something about this particular situation settled itself firmly in his conscience, refusing to be filed away, and forgotten the way so many minor household disputes often were. He thought of the name carved into the wooden post. He thought of the tired certainty in her voice when she spoke of men like him only visiting, never changing. He intended, more than anything else, to prove that certainty wrong, not for the sake of proving a point, but because it was, quite simply, the right thing to do, and he had grown weary over the years of watching good people suffer quietly while those responsible offered nothing but polished excuses. Tomorrow, he thought, closing the final ledger and setting down his quill. Tomorrow, this house begins to change, whether Lady Constance welcomes it or not. Morning arrived gray and still, the kind of quiet that comes before something significant, and the entire household gathered in the main hall exactly as instructed, family and staff standing together in a room that had never before held both groups at once. Lady Constance stood near the front, her posture rigid, her expression carefully composed despite the tension visible in the set of her shoulders. Lord Edmund stood beside her, unusually pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The staff filled the remaining space, Mrs. Prout near the front with the senior servants, Mrs. Holt beside her, Colin standing near the back beside two stable hands who rarely came near the main house at all. Elira stood among them, uncertain where exactly she belonged in a gathering like this, choosing a spot near the edge of the room where she could see without drawing unnecessary attention to herself, an old habit that no longer served much purpose given everything that had already occurred. The Duke entered a few minutes later, dressed simply, without the fine coat he had worn for dinner that first night, carrying with him a small stack of papers that he set down on a nearby table before addressing the room. "Thank you all for gathering," he began, his voice carrying easily through the quiet hall. "I know this is unusual, and I understand it may cause some concern among those of you unaccustomed to such meetings. I ask only for your patience while I explain the purpose behind it." He paused, glancing briefly toward Lady Constance, whose expression remained fixed, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension. "I came to this estate to review its finances, as is customary given the debts owed to my family. In the course of that review, I discovered matters that concern not only the numbers within these ledgers, but the treatment of the people who make this estate function at all." A murmur passed briefly through the staff, quickly silenced as the Duke continued. "I will not stand here and list every small grievance I have uncovered these past days. Some matters are best addressed privately, and I intend to do so where appropriate. But there is one matter I believe deserves to be spoken plainly, in front of everyone gathered here, because I believe silence has allowed it to continue for far too long." He turned, and for the first time since entering the room, his gaze settled directly on Alira, who felt her heart quicken under the sudden weight of every eye in the room following his own. 5 years ago, a young woman came to serve this household, having lost her family to circumstances entirely beyond her control. She worked diligently in this house, first as a kitchen maid sharing quarters with others, until circumstances arose that led to her removal from those quarters entirely. For the past 2 years, she has slept in the estate stable, in conditions unfit for any member of this household, family, or staff, regardless of position. Lady Constance's composure cracked visibly now, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "I have learned," the Duke continued, "that this arrangement did not arise from practical necessity, as I was told, but from a decision made after this young woman showed simple kindness toward a child in this household, kindness that apparently threatened someone's sense of control more than it warranted any genuine concern." He looked toward Lady Constance now, his voice remaining calm, though the words themselves carried unmistakable weight. "I do not believe cruelty always announces itself boldly, Lady Constance. Sometimes it hides behind explanations that sound reasonable enough on their surface, until someone takes the time to look closely at what lies beneath them. I have taken that time these past several days, and what I have found troubles me deeply." The room remained utterly silent, every servant present holding their breath, uncertain what might follow such a direct accusation spoken so plainly before them all. "This estate's debts to my family are significant," the Duke continued, "significant enough that I could, if I chose, impose consequences severe enough to threaten this family's continued position entirely. I do not intend to do that today, though I will say plainly that continued mismanagement, financial or otherwise, will not be tolerated indefinitely." Lord Edmund's shoulders sagged slightly with something that looked almost like relief, though Lady Constance's expression remained tight, bracing for whatever came next. "What I do intend," the Duke said, "is to ensure that the people who serve this household are treated with the basic decency every person deserves, regardless of their position. Effective immediately, proper living quarters will be arranged for every member of staff currently housed inadequately, beginning with Alira, who will be given a room within the main house befitting 5 years of loyal, uncomplaining service." He paused, allowing the words to settle over the room before continuing. "I will also be arranging for a fair review of wages across this household, to ensure that informal arrangements do not continue to substitute for compensation owed. Mrs. Prout will assist me in compiling an accurate accounting of every staff member's proper due." Mrs. Prout nodded quickly, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief that such words were truly being spoken aloud. The Duke then turned his attention fully to Alira, softening his tone slightly as he addressed her directly in front of the gathered room. "I understand that trust, once broken repeatedly, is not easily rebuilt through words alone. I do not expect you to simply accept these changes without seeing them proven through action, but I wish to offer you a choice, one that has, I believe, been denied to you for far too long." He gestured to the papers still resting on the nearby table. "You may remain in this household, under the conditions I have just described, with proper quarters, proper wages, and my personal assurance that any future mistreatment will be addressed immediately and without hesitation. Or, if you find you no longer wish to remain in a place that has caused you such difficulty, I am prepared to offer you a position within my own household, along with resources enough to establish an independent life, should you prefer that path instead. The choice is entirely yours to make, in your own time, without pressure from myself or anyone else in this room." A stunned silence followed, broken only by the soft sound of Lady Constance's sharp intake of breath, her carefully maintained composure finally giving way entirely to open shock. Alira stood very still, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room, though strangely, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that weight did not feel like a burden pressing down on her. It felt, instead, like the first honest attention she had received in this house that did not come wrapped in suspicion or dismissal. "I would like a few days to consider it, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly moving beneath it. "If that is permitted." "Of course," the Duke said. "Take whatever time you need. There is no obligation attached to this offer beyond my own wish to see you treated as you always deserve to be." The gathering dispersed shortly after, servants returning to their duties in a daze of quiet disbelief, whispering among themselves as they went, while Lady Constance remained rooted near the front of the hall, her carefully constructed authority over this household having crumbled more thoroughly in that single conversation than in all the years preceding it. Over the following days, changes began to unfold across the estate exactly as the Duke had promised. A proper room was prepared for Elira within the main house, modest but warm, with a door that locked from the inside and a window that let in morning light rather than the cold drafts of the stable. Mrs. Prout worked diligently alongside the Duke's own steward to establish fair wages for every member of staff, several of whom discovered, to their quiet astonishment, that years of underpayment were finally being corrected. Lady Constance, stripped of the unquestioned authority she had wielded for so long, retreated largely from household matters, her influence diminished considerably under the Duke's continued oversight of the estate's affairs. Lord Edmund, for his part, seemed almost relieved by the shift, having long grown weary of decisions made without his full agreement, though he said little about it openly. Colin found Elira in her new room one evening, standing near the window, looking out at the stable in the distance, its familiar shape now viewed from a very different vantage point. "Strange, is it not?" he said, leaning against the doorway, "looking at that old place from up here." "Strange," Elira agreed, "but not unwelcome." "Have you decided," Colin asked, "whether you will stay or go with the Duke's household?" She considered the question for a long moment, watching the last light of evening fade over the yard below. "I have decided that for the first time in 5 years, I am the one making the choice, rather than having it made for me. That alone feels like enough for now to build something upon." A few days later, the Duke prepared to depart the estate, his business concluded, though he made a point of speaking with Elira privately before his carriage arrived, finding her near the garden where she had taken to walking during the quiet hours of the afternoon, a small freedom she had never before been permitted to enjoy. "I have decided to remain," she told him before he could ask. "This house is beginning to feel different than it once did. I believe I would like to see what it becomes, now that it has been given the chance to change." "A wise choice, if it is truly what you wish," the Duke said. "But know that the offer remains open should circumstances ever require it. My household will always have a place for someone who has proven, through 5 years of quiet endurance, more character than most people demonstrate in a lifetime." "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, "for seeing what others chose not to." "Sometimes," the Duke said, "the truth simply requires someone willing to look properly for it. You deserved that far sooner than you received it. I am only sorry it took as long as it did." He departed that afternoon, his carriage moving down the long gravel path away from the estate, leaving behind a household transformed in ways both visible and quiet. The stable stood empty of any sleeping arrangement now, used only for its intended purpose, the horses cared for by staff who came and went freely from proper quarters of their own. Elira remained in the garden long after the carriage disappeared from view, feeling, for the first time she could clearly remember, that the ground beneath her belonged to her as much as to anyone else standing upon it. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it none of the cold uncertainty that had once defined every quiet moment of her life within these walls. She turned finally and walked back toward the house, not through the servants' entrance out of habit, but through the front door, unhindered, unquestioned, exactly as she deserved.